Both of our wives are my Should we begin?
You're live.
Okay. Welcome to the Shevchenko Scientific Society. Tonight, the author Vladislav Davidzon will have a book launch and will moderate a discourse about the book with Adrian Karatnycky. Vladislav Davidzon is a European cultural correspondent at Tablet, a fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, and the author of From Odessa with Love, Political and Literary Essay in Post-Soviet Ukraine. He was the founder and the chief editor of the Odessa Review, and he is a contributor to Foreign Policy Magazine and the Opinion section and the Wall Street Journal. Adrian Karatnycky, formerly the president of Freedom House, is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a board member and co-director in the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter. He is a contributor to Foreign Affairs, Newsweek, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, Foreign Policy, etc., etc. He is the author of the forthcoming book, Battleground Ukraine, From Independence to the War with Russia. Welcome, gentlemen.
Let me begin with a deeper introduction. We're here, first of all, this is a book launch, so we're here to sell books. So part of this discourse is to advance human knowledge. It is also to give you a sense of the flavor of this book and to make you more interested in buying it than not. Vlad Davidzon has been on the ground in Ukraine, for nearly a decade and a half. And he lived in Odessa. He moved to Odessa in 2011. He was there primarily operating out of Ukraine and partly out of Paris throughout that period. During the beginning of the war, found him in Kyiv. He then was courageously reporting from combat zones and close to combat zones. In some of these episodes, he's been closely affiliated with Bernard-Henri Lévy, who has written a splendid introduction forward to this book. And Bernard, as you well know, has been one of the great chroniclers of major conflicts and wars, including the war that began in 2014 and which accelerated to the major war that Russia launched in February of 2022. Now, Vlad has a history as an art critic. He is also an artist who produces incredible illustrated notebooks. But mainly he is a close observer and analyst of, at this point, Ukrainian, Russian, and Jewish cultures in all of their complex interactions. And this book is an important and I would say encyclopedic, though not exhaustive, guide to the many dimensions of Jewish life and the history of Jewish life in Ukraine. Just because you do not yet have the benefit of its table of contents, he deals with everything from the Ukrainian integral nationalism to Metropolitan Sheptytsky to Putin's views on Jewry to various gangsters, rakes, criminals, and I was going to say parliamentarians, but I think I just went through that list. Oligarchs, con men, of all nationalities that he has encountered in his reporting, mainly for the tablet, but also his analytic reporting and writing for Foreign Policy Magazine and for other sources. So we're going to do this way, as this is intended to be a session that helps to promote Vlad's book. We'll ask him to do a bit of reading for maybe 10 or 15 minutes to give you a flavor of some of the issues that he addresses and how he addresses them. Then I'll do like a half hour back and forth, and then with your permission, if there is interest, we'll take some questions from the floor. Before I end this, I have to say that the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter was mentioned, but I have to declare an interest. First of all, we are both colleagues at the Atlantic Council, but secondly, the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter has been a supporter of Vladislav's research and his work on Ukrainian Jewish topics. And the other thing that I've neglected to mention as part of his biography is that Vlad's understanding of Ukraine is very much enriched by his marriage to a Ukrainian woman of Jewish extraction,
And Polish extraction.
and Regina and Romanian, I guess, today. Regina Marianovska, who is an important, who just walked in belatedly, who is a film producer who just had a very successful launch of a film at the Amsterdam the lead opening film of the Amsterdam Documentary Film Festival. So I think this is enough of a sense of what we're going to do here, and I'll turn it over to Vladislav, and I can hold the microphone for you if you want to read, or if you feel more comfortable.
Let me think. First of all, thank you, Adriano. Thank you for your support in every sense, and your great friendship, your intelligence, your generosity, your everything. To qualify again, there are pieces about Ukrainian Jewish Encounters stuff in here, and this being a book that was 10 years in the making, they were all written before I became a grantee of Ukrainian Jewish Encounter. These are my best pieces on this particular theme. This is my second book of essays. This is about a fifth of the stuff that I've written on Ukrainian Jewish relations over the course of the last 10 years. These are the pieces that I collected and selected and curated that give the best flow and the best understanding of the various issues that one needs to understand the last 10 years, and the way that the Ukrainian Jewish relationship is basically a heuristic for understanding everything about contemporary Ukraine, and why I think that one cannot understand the way that Ukraine has developed as a political nation without understanding this very interesting and remarkable story, an important story. So the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter have been doing wonderful work. I'm very grateful for their friendship, and this book would not be possible without their moral support. And I will begin by just talking a little bit about the first essay of the book, which was the title essay of the Jewish Quarterly for 2022, the January-February edition of the Jewish Quarterly. It came out about a year ago. This was a 15,000 word essay, the leading essay for the English language and the Anglo-British world's leading Jewish intellectual quarterly. They asked me to do 15,000 words on this thing that I'm specialized on, and it took tremendous effort because there's so much to compile and there's so much to distill. I tried to tell the entire story in 15,000 words, and then at first they said 10,000 words, and I said, come on. There was a lot of editing, and it was very humorous. My editor was exasperated with my continuously editing, giving pieces in piece by piece of the 14,000 words chunks of the essay. Finally, with 5 days before we had to close the issue, he yelled at me. He finally got exasperated. He yelled at me. He said, "We haven't missed a single issue since Hitler." I don't have any copy in 5 days. I don't know what I'm gonna do. Do you want to be the first writer since Hitler to keep the Jewish Quarterly from being released? And I said, no, I do not. So finally, the essay did get in. I think it was worth the 3 months of work, because there's just it's just a really strong distillation, if I do say so myself, of a lot of important issues. So I'm going to read little chunks of it so you get a sense of the frame of the book, my interests, my viewpoints, and my style. So, no contemporary reckoning with the millennium-long history of Ukrainian Jewry can commence without acknowledging the obvious. The nation is now fighting for its very survival. This war is being waged by a committed, fearsome, and obsessive adversary, a country that cannot let go of its traumatized past, with a leader who has desperately staked both legitimacy of his regime, his political future, and his own life on the bloody construction of a bygone empire. Yet if the Soviet Empire is now experiencing its final gasps and dying twitches, the Russian war against Kiev has revealed certain erroneous suppositions widely held by many of us, specifically those of us post-Soviet Jews and citizens who had assumed we had avoided Yugoslav-style bloodshed through a peaceful dissolution of the Union. This includes me, dear reader. I was born in Uzbekistan during the first days of perestroika to Russified Ukrainian Jews who had been evacuated in 1941 ahead of Hitler's advancing armies. My grandparents are from Ukraine, two of them. One is from the Belarus, Ukrainian borderlands, and I have a Russian grandmother, actually, who was born in Batumi and married a Jewish gentleman who was my grandfather. And it just so happened that I was born, just so you get a little bit of a sense of my background, because I'm of the Ukrainian diaspora, the Ukrainian Jewish diaspora, but in a way that is very odd, in that my grandparents were evacuated out of Poltava and Chernovtsi and Vinnytsia and all those places to Uzbekistan, where my family lived until everyone left Uzbekistan. There was a mass exodus of Ukrainians and Russians and Jews and Koreans in the late 80s and early 90s as the union dissolved, and there was no reason to stay there. Those ethnicities left, returned to Ukraine or Israel or Germany or Russia, where they were from. And so my family wound up in Moscow for about 2 years, where we waited for paperwork to move to America. And so I grew up in South Brooklyn. I'm from that other diaspora, so I come from a Russian-speaking diaspora family, but I grew up in a heavily Ukrainian situation, a heavily Jewish situation. So these are three diasporas that I grew up in South Brooklyn, who in the 90s were almost kind of indeterminate. There was less kind of, it was more kind of reflexive at the time. No one was really in the early 90s and early aughts, when I was a young Brooklynite, was really thinking very much about the differences between Ukrainian Jews and Ukrainians and Russian Jews and Russians. Those are much more modern preoccupations, right? So that's just a little bit about my background. I did inherit a Russian passport from my father, and I burned it immediately when the war began in March. Right after, my wife called me from Paris, and I was in Kiev, and she called me crying, and she asked me on the 25th of February to burn my Russian passport, which I did.
In the company of the former Estonian president.
Yeah, so I asked Tumas Ilves, a great New Jerseyan, right, the only New Jerseyan to ever been president of an Eastern European country, as far as I know, to hold the lighter, and President Tumas Ilves of Estonia, Swedish-born, American-made Estonian president, held the lighter, and we put on a good show, and also it was important. And by doing so, I signaled my place in the Ukrainian Jewish diaspora rather than the Russian Jewish diaspora. I think of myself as a Ukrainian Jew who has re-Ukrainized through 14 years of living in Ukraine, marriage to Ukrainian, and I hope some small amount of service to the Ukrainian nation. The war to escape Russian domination, it turns out, had merely been put off for several decades. In September of 22, the Jewish-Ukrainian businessman Viktor Pinchuk opened his annual star-studded Yalta European Strategy political conference in Kiev, forum he calls it, by explaining to the assembled dignitaries that they, the Ukrainians, had been operating on the false assumption that they had won independence. This is a quote from Mr. Pinchuk. We thought that we had gotten independence in 1991, but it turns out that we had only gotten it formally. It's a very expensive thing, independence. He's a businessman, he operates in those categories. And it works only if it is paid for in full. There's a cost and a price. Right? This is understandable to Americans. Blood of patriots, right? True liberty. The breakdown of the empire had not really happened yet, and a dinosaur can take a very long time to die, he underlined. So I talk a little bit about Zelensky, who has since joined Israeli president, and Latvian-born Igils Levits in that rarefied world club of Jewish heads of state. And the election of Zelensky was fascinating exactly for how ordinary it all seemed to Ukrainians at the time, for how little his being a Jew had mattered during the campaign. It even casually made ribald jokes about it. I will send my Jewish mother after you, he threatened his opponent. I'm not going to do my Zelensky impression on camera, but it's pretty good, my friends say. He threatened his opponent, incumbent President Poroshenko, during one of their debates. The banner of contemporary Ukrainian civic nationalism, one based not on ethnic or linguistic definitions or regional definitions of belonging, but rather on values and mentality and on national pride, was being carried by a slight, muscular Jewish comedian from a Russian-speaking part of the country. This sort of political and social equanimity has not, to put it mildly, been the historical note. So I talk a little bit about former Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, who kind of denied that he was Jewish in 2 presidential cycles before. And I tell a joke about him sitting next to Yatsenyuk at lunch, and I asked him if he himself was a member of a tribe, and he joked to me that I never thought to ask my mother about it. When I asked Yatsenyuk if it was true, the rumors are true. He said, I never thought to ask my mother about it. It's a very, very, very charming cavalier response. Jews in Ukraine and Ukrainian Jews is chunk 2 of the Jews of Ukraine, the opening essay. The uncertainty about Yatsenyuk's lineage is symptomatic of the elusiveness of any attempt to delineate the tremendously rich and ancient history of Ukraine's Jews. Ukrainian Jews are in many ways a new phenomenon because the Ukrainian state in its current form is a modern creation. The accomplishments and identities of Ukrainian Jews almost always belong to other national histories as well, or only to those national histories. That way, Ukrainian Jewish history resembles the broader Ukrainian national history and is a microcosm of it. Each has simultaneously existed and not existed over the course of many centuries. Occupied, effaced, partitioned, continually expunged out of existence as a separate nation, Ukrainians have been ruled successively by Turks, Poles, Lithuanians, Germans, and Russians. And all the while, they engaged in continuous and often doomed national rebellions. Jews have also lived with Ukrainians in the land of the Slavs for centuries during their suppression. The often systematic repression of the Ukrainian nation, its culture and language, have been targeted by parallel suppression. There's the Jews, 2 nations living together, not in other people's empires. This is the parallel life of Jews and Ukrainians under German or Turkish or Lithuanian, Polish or Russian rule. Should be acknowledged that all different kinds of Jews have lived in these lands. Many now viewed as Ukrainian Jews certainly would not have thought themselves as such as for the time when they lived. For most of the last millennium and a half, a Jew who spoke a language other than Yiddish or Hebrew would be as likely to be conversant in a Turkic dialect as in any Slavic tongue. Later, there would be a Jewish contribution to Ukrainian language literature, even as Ukrainian became viewed in Russian imperial and chauvinist circles as the language of peasants and country bumpkins. View that has sadly lingered in modern times in certain circles, but it's quickly diminishing. That view, that view is going away very quickly and has been for the last 30 years. Karatnycky, for example, was perhaps the first serious Jewish poet to have published good verse in Ukrainian in the 1890s. A Ukrainian search for usable past in the context of statelessness is an instinct that should be instantly familiar to contemporary Jews, who likewise only received national statehood in the 20th century. So I talk a little bit about the parallels of the search for what it was that is now seen as Ukrainian art history, Russian art history, talk about all the different canonical figures that we think of as Soviet or Russian, who are actually like Dziga Vertov or Kaufman or Malevich, part of the Ukrainian canon, and will be seen more and more as such, right? So in fact, any attempt to delineate a particularly Ukrainian Jewish history, especially one that has existed prior to the 16th century, often involves making capricious or highly contestable judgments about which Jewish histories, movements, artworks, personages, facts, movements, etc., to simulate into that history. A prominent rabbi, politician, or poet might have been born on the wrong side of a Hungarian imperial border, or on the Belarusian lands next to a Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, as my own ancestors were, and so might be retroactively ascribed to German, Russian, Polish, or Ukrainian history or culture on his Wikipedia page. My own paternal grandfather was born into a Romanian shtetl, grandmother, not that was, yeah, yes, and became a Soviet citizen before being evacuated from Moldova to Central Asia by the Soviets, finally dying an American citizen in Brooklyn. So my grandmother was born in a Romanian shtetl in Chernowitz in between the wars. Her own father was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Her son was born in Uzbekistan. His grandson is now here in America and now lives in France. It's a particularly Eastern European story. And my kids, when I get around to having them, I will have take Ukrainian citizenship again. So things come around, right? I've often thought of a particular poet, rabbi, artist, actor as an example of Ukrainian Jewry, only to learn about their Wikipedia entry that they are capriciously written about in the Russian, Moldovan, or Belarus section of that encyclopedia, right? So the category of Ukrainian Jews thus elusive, mutable, and all too modern. So I think that's enough of a preamble, right? I talk a little bit more about the Khazars. There's not really a lot to talk about because we actually don't know much about Khazars. Anyone who thinks that they know anything about Khazars is kind of a con man. I mean, we don't.
Arthur Kessler was a con.
Arthur Kessler, Kusler in the Hungarian Kessler, was the leader of disseminating that conspiracy theory. Although a lot of Russian and Ukrainian Jews wind up having tiny bits of Khazar DNA, the DNA people tell us, right? So the conspiracy theory has a tiny bit of truth to it. If you're 1% Khazar in your DNA and you're 95% Ashkenazi, is Arthur Kusler wrong? Yes, he is. So in the 9th century, the stolidly anti-rabbinic Karaites, often described as sectarian in origin, arrived in the Crimean port town of Feodosia after passing through the Holy Land of Persia. We actually have a prominent Iranian intellectual here today. I'd like to say hello to Mr. Durjani, sitting in the front row. And if we do get around to contemporary events, which we might, we'll have a respondent from a little bit of Iranian background. So Turkic rulers of the peninsula, whether the Khazars or later the local ruling faction of a Golden Horde, protected and tolerated the Jews while levying taxes on them. At the same time, the Jewish population of the peninsula was soon reinforced by communities of Jews who fled coerced conversion amid renewed religious fervor amongst the Byzantine emperors. The Byzantine emperors became more religious in the 15th century, and they told the Jews to convert to Byzantine Christianity, and a lot of them fled to Crimea. So basically, in this essay, I tried to tell the stories of the three Jewish civilizations of Ukraine, which are Khazar, very long time ago, where there was a Jewish kingdom in contemporary Ukraine. The Turkic Jews, whether the Krimchaks or the Karaites, which were different, and of course the Ashkenazi civilization, which people think of when they think of Ukrainian Jews, as opposed to the Greek Jewish settlers on the Pontius, or the very odd exceptions to the rule, like the Polish-Lithuanian Jews from Turkish backgrounds who did exist until very recently. And I think that's enough of the preamble, good sir.
It's great to get us closer to the present, but not too close to the present, so that we can discuss some of the historical issues that loom large in the mythologies and the histories of the encounter between the Jewish and Ukrainian people. But let me start from the present. As Ukraine is trying to decouple from Russia, the Russian Empire, colonialism, and so on, maybe we can dispute this or not. Sometimes with too much enthusiasm, sometimes with insufficient enthusiasm. There is a similar project of encompassing the Jewish past on Ukrainian soil more deeply into the Ukrainian discourse. And part of your life is communing with Ukrainian writers, filmmakers, artists, intellectuals. Maybe you can talk a little bit about this coupling that is occurring at the same time as that kind of decoupling from Russia. And of course, there is a lot of that in your many essays.
Yeah, thank you. So the book is 25 essays on these very themes. I do feel that this is an old story in some ways that has been rekindled after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and in some ways a completely new story. So you have the creation of a post-Soviet political nation, and it's not dissimilar from the creation of other nations which are carved out of the corpse of a Soviet state, right? The bloated corpse of a Soviet state. But in many ways, it is a very special story. There is no other Slavic post-Soviet state that has had a post-Soviet, with the exception of Madame Sandu in Moldova, which I think happened actually after Zelensky was elected, right? There's not been a Jewish person elected leader of Moldova, Belarus, Russia, Ukraine. These are states which are mostly people who are Slavs. Well, Moldova is different, but who has also come out of the post-Soviet world. President Zelensky is in many ways a representative of contemporary Ukrainian ordinariness, but is also an extraordinary man in many ways. But also just a sociological example of the post-Soviet generation that comes after the collapse of the Soviet Union. He's only about 4 or 5 years older than I am, and he comes of age in the 80s and 90s, right? So, unlike Poroshenko, who was a kid of the 70s and 80s, and Putin, who comes straight out of the 40s and 50s, and Lukashenko, who comes out of the 50s and early 60s, Zelensky is truly a post-Soviet head of state, and he represents someone who was not born, was 15 or a teenager when the Soviet Union collapses, right? And his formative experiences are in the 90s. He's 25 when Putin comes to power, right? He's 15 when the Soviet Union dissolves, 25, 10 years later. There is a tremendous relationship between Ukrainian titular nationalism, which is the nationalism of the titular nation. I purposely don't call it ethnic nationalism. I always get pissed off and argue with my counterparts and my colleagues in other newspapers, Economist and other places, The Guardian. They say Poroshenko is the president of representative of ethnic nationalism. I say, no, not ethnic, of titular nationalism, of the symbols and language and culture of the titular nation, which everyone in Ukraine who went to Ukrainian high school is conversant in, even if they have other identities and other views and other languages and other cultures, right? With the other Ukraine, which is the Ukraine of the political nation, the Ukraine of many languages, of many cultures, of many polities, of many identities, of many religions, right? The Ukraine of you're Ukrainian because you're born here and because you like it here and because you don't want other people ruling here, no matter how you worship or what you speak at home. Maybe you speak Bulgarian at home or Romanian at home. So I see the book as explaining the thesis that the relationship of the Jews to the contemporary Ukrainian state is the oral relationship to understand the construction of a modern, contemporary, liberal, democratic national state. Right. That is my basic thesis. So to get back to the question as a long preamble, many of the finest intellectuals in contemporary Ukraine come out of Jewish backgrounds or are Jews themselves, and the political class is heavily Jewish, the same way that it is in France or the UK or America or Germany, and that is considered completely normal. Some people are discreet about it. Some people don't care about it. Some Ukrainian politicians I've talked to, it's not a big deal for them. Some people, it's very central to their identity. And one of the most interesting things about the 2014 to 19 parliament, where about 10% of the MPs were Jewish descent, is that they were spread out through every single party. There was not a party, well, somewhat like in America, where Jews predominantly vote for one party. They did not vote for one party. There were Jews in Poroshenko's party. There were Jews with Yulia. There were Jews in opposition bloc. There were Jews unaligned from Lviv and Samopovich. There was literally it didn't matter. There were Ukrainian citizens of Jewish descent, and many of them religious or culturally deeply Jewish or interested, who were from every different party. Right, I actually tried to at one point figure out which party is the party of Ukrainian Jewry, and there was not one. They represented everybody, including the very unpleasant people. Yes, sir.
Wasn't there a Jewish party?
Well, in the 1920s, there were 5 Jewish parties in the Ukrainian parliament, but not in the recent years. No, maybe we'll start one. What do you think?
There was a Jewish oligarch who founded a political party, I believe.
Oh, yes, Rabinovich. Yes, there were. You mean Rabinovich or Kolomoisky?
I sat next to one.
I think you're discussing Mr. Rabinovich. He had a television station, right? Yes. So there was a. There are arguably several political parties in Ukraine in the last election cycle which had a. This is insider baseball. We'll discuss this. Yeah, well, this is a good question. I'm grateful we can come back to slightly insider baseball. Yeah, we're gonna get too off into the weeds. So let's continue. So the relationship to Jews is a particular interest of contemporary Ukrainian intellectuals who are not Jewish. And I've never met serious anti-Semites amongst any serious Ukrainian contemporary writer or thinker, intellectual. So I think we can continue on.
So let's talk a little bit about. I think the world, the United States, is rediscovering Ukraine, partly because of the great attention paid to recent, the war. There is a kind of a proliferation of books that are being translated. The discourse, films are being more widely distributed and watched, and I think there is a kind of a better understanding, at least of contemporary Ukraine, from this more open-minded civilization that you've encountered and that you've described, which really expressed itself very fundamentally in the Maidan. Although I have to say that really the values that you mentioned, these sort of liberal, inclusive values, were present among the people who really gave the ruch, and Vyacheslav Chernomil and the Ukrainian former political prisoners and dissidents who established sort of the ground rules of what was called a national democracy, national demokratична течія, the national democratic tendency, which never took power but had significant influence in shaping the discourse, even within the what you would call titular nationalism, nationalism discourse. But it really kind of that core of these ideas gained further momentum as a result of the Maidan and of the broader discourse that you spoke about of the re-examination of Jewish life, including some of the dark moments. But what I wanted to say was, let's talk about the diaspora Jewish community, the Jewish community in North America, the Jewish community in Europe. Many Americans, I think in general, had very vague views of Ukraine, but I would have to say that Jews in the main had a very specific view of Ukraine and Ukrainians, and it was primarily focused on A, collaborationism, B, anti-Semitism, and C, pogroms. How have you seen the evolution of the understanding of Ukraine's past within the Jewish community? And you've, in fact, contributed to a broadening of that understanding. But how do you see it at this moment of history? And how do you see the relations between the two peoples, the two diasporas, or at least within the sort of the circles of the intelligentsia and the sort of the commentatorati or whatever you like?
Yeah, that's a really great thing. First of all, I'm not I wasn't trying to say that the roots of the tolerance and the liberalism, the broad-mindedness, which I think are characterological to contemporary Ukrainian citizens, came out of the Maidan. Obviously, things have deep roots and multivariate causes and effects. Obviously, it's a very old nation. It's a European country, which means it's unlike this country, multiple hundreds or 1,000 years old in some ways, and it's historical in a sense, very deep indeed. Ukrainians, and I have to always explain this to Jewish audiences when I go around synagogues, explaining the difference between, let's say, Poland and Ukraine, where Poland after the war didn't have many Jews left, or actually any kinds of people were not Polish. The Germans were gone for understandable reasons. The Ruthenians, the Polish, the population transfers, the territorial transfers, the emigration, World War II leveled Polish territory, and at the end of the war, it was basically very, it was just it was not full of different kinds of people, right? The ethnic tapestry of Poland was basically one kind of people, one kind of religiosity, one language, one culture, one state, one church. That didn't happen in Ukraine, and Ukrainians have had to live with all sorts of different people, and after World War II, Ukraine was still full of all sorts of different people, right? That is just something that makes it different from some of its Eastern European neighbors, from the Poles, from the Belarusians, from the Bulgarians, right? It is probably the most multi-ethnic, multifaceted, multicultural country in that part of its region, right? So a lot of it is just the fact that Ukrainians have day-to-day experience of living with people who are not like them. So obviously Baruch, what was it, the group of 239? Was it who signed the original, what was it called, the constitutional, what did the group of 239 sign? It was the
group of 239 didn't do anything. There was a broader group of people who had a consensus to declare the country's independence. So I don't know.
Right. Okay. Right. Okay. We'll let that pass. The movement for the way that Ukrainian nationalism turned out, and obviously, like anything else, it could turn out in different ways based on all sorts of historical structures and outcomes, was based on particular ideological things that happened right after the Soviet Union collapsed, right? And that it turned out to be as liberal as it was and is a testament to, first of all, the Jewish community taking the Ukrainian side in this war, a war of memory and a war of arms, right, against the Russian state, and also of the many number of brave young Ukrainians who came back with IDF service from Israel, who took part in the Maidan, who took part in the early battles against the Russians in Donetsk and Lugansk and Avdiivka in 2014 and 15. And so I think the Ukrainian nation saw that that Jews were on side, right? Even Kolomoisky, great oligarch, kind of over the top, horrible character in some ways, a troll and eccentric figure. He did take the side of Ukrainian state in 2014 for all his many flaws, right? And this was not forgotten in many circles, and I think it earned the Ukrainian Jewry a great deal of received credit, accumulated credit. So as to the question of the diaspora, it just happened that a lot of Jews in America didn't know very much about Ukraine for all sorts of reasons. And over the last 10 years, they've had to learn more. And, this war in many ways has made Jews in America have to rethink their hereto unreflected on predicates. So what does it mean to be a Jew from the Russian Empire? You didn't ask your grandfather where shtetl was. Was it actually in Belarus, or was it in next to Rostov in Russia, or are you actually from the environs of Odessa or Kiev? Are you from Chernowitz and you're saying you're from the Russian Empire? How are you from the Russian Empire if you're from Chernowitz, right? Which was in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and then in Romania. How are you from the Russian Empire if you were born in place like Lviv or Kiev? So as the war starts, there are a lot of Jews in America, especially amongst the thinking class, the intelligentsia class, the leadership class, who have to start rethinking what it means to be from that part of the world. Another part of that is that nobody wants to be on the side of a genocidal state, right? Like nobody wants to think of himself as a Russian Jew when Russians are spreading Russian culture by bombing Russian-speaking theaters in Mariupol and Odessa, right? And Kiev. What does it mean to be a Russian Jew when you've been in America since 1894, right? And you start having to why do I want to be a Russian Jew? I mean, this is not cool. Russian culture is now kidnapping babies, right? And stealing anything that's not nailed down. So there is, over the last couple of years, this kind of slow reflection of what it means to come from these lands. Also, a lot of American Jews and American organizations who had their greatest moments in the last 80 years in their great victory over the Soviets and in getting the Soviet Jews a chance to leave, like my own family, Russia, Ukraine, Uzbekistan. They understand very well that and it's a huge moment of shame for for American Jews that they didn't do much during the Holocaust, right? This is a great internal shame amongst the older generation of American Jewish leaders. They let down their brethren in Europe in the 40s. And they know very well that they did not accomplish what they needed to. And so now, in that context, they're trying to figure out what does it mean when there are two countries where a lot of their grandparents are from, and their distant relatives still live, who are fighting a war against each other, right? We've not had Jews on two sides of a European war since World War I, right? You literally, last time this has happened was when there were Jews in the French, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and German armies butchering each other in World War I, right? This has not happened to our people in 110 years. This is why we have Israel. You're not supposed to be killing other Jews. It's kind of like, this is like really an unpleasant thing for me as a Jew, that there are Jews in the Russian army killing my friends and my brethren in Ukraine, right? And so, and also in these conversations that I have with Jewish elites, they're trying to figure out who's really in trouble. Is it the Russian Jews who are hostages of the Russian state, or is it the Ukrainian Jews who are now becoming ever more Ukrainian? Their kids are Ukrainianizing and need to be helped, right? So there's a lot of confusion amongst contemporary Jewish diasporas in Canada and America. And there's a lot of interest, and it's really sincere interest. And there's a lot of sincere goodwill towards Ukraine, just as much as there are still echoes of these things that we all know about, these unpleasant narratives that are left over from World War II, unpleasant histories, with a mixture of collaboration and not understanding what happened with Jewish and Ukrainian POWs and when they came to Canada, that kind of thing. So it's a very kind of painful and messy process for a lot of people to think through. Is that a good answer?
It's the beginning of an answer.
Yeah, so much to
But
say.
it can only be the beginning of an answer.
Right.
Let me, ask you a complicated question, but with a little preamble. It's the term Žid and Jewry, which has been transformed into, Žid has been stripped of its neutral status and is perceived as an affront. But I want to go back to the idea of in Kievan Rus, the Jewish district in Kiev was called Zhidove. And so there are long historical roots, which originates from, I guess, a Slavic version of referring to Judaism, to the faith, rather, than to Jewry based on, I guess, linguistic and national characteristics. But the reason I ask that is because in one interview, I think maybe flippantly, but maybe not so flippantly, you refer to yourself as a Žido Bandera.
Yes, of course.
And I want you to talk a little bit about the Bandera cult in Ukraine.
Oh my God.
How influential is it? How helpful or harmful is it to the Ukrainian Jewish communion and understanding, and also how you see, and then a separate question which we will come to, which is Putin and fascism. But let's not go there. Let's first answer the question why you were comfortable in using that phrase to kind of make it less charged, it seems to me, in the way that African Americans use the N word to make it less resonant.
Yeah, well, okay, great. I'm gonna have to go on the record with what I actually think about this. By the way, we have a descendant of Bandera sitting just looking at me right now, and to answer this, yeah, we have Mr. Bandera here.
Please, let's.
Yeah, we were actually last night. It's a long answer, and I have to be very precise. It's a very explosive question. It's a very precise thing. So let me be very careful and very precise and very serious with my answer. A lot of his book is about World War II politics and about history politics and memory politics. And is the politics that motivates the Russian state under Kremlin. It is in fact the linchpin of their political ideological project, it now being a dictatorship of all sorts of different people, and it's backward looking as opposed to futurist. They have to keep together all sorts of different people of force and propaganda, and a lot of the propaganda is based on Soviet nostalgia minus economic communism and the brotherhood of man, right? So the Putin's Russia is very much committed to a very noxious and toxic cocktail of propagandistic narratives about World War II, some of which have a lot of elements of truth to them, some which are completely insane and noxious and vicious and chauvinistic and identitarian and are really unpleasant. And so I deal in this book a lot with the Russian narrative and the Russian propaganda, right? And with what Jews in the diaspora think about that Russian propaganda, about Soviet history and World War II and Bandera and Shukhevich and all this stuff, right? So I start off with the fact that I am a Ukrainian Jew and I care about this country and my relatives there who I had to evacuate during the war. President Putin didn't need to come and bomb my relatives in order to free us from a Nazi state led by a Jew. No, thank you, right? Let's just start with that. So my personal views are those of a patriot of a state who thinks that we should push back very severely on those narratives, which have a great deal of influence in the diaspora, right? So the Żydo-Banderovite flippant claim comes from around 2013, 2014, when Ukrainian Jews start to reclaim the term of Judeo-Banderites. When people in the Russian orbit propagandists would refer to Ukrainians as Banderites because they were patriots of their own state, because they wanted their own country, they would deploy this propagandistic narrative, right? So I'm very deeply empathetic towards the Ukrainian Jewish community, including members of the Jewish elite of Ukraine, who started in 2014 and 15 wearing these satirical shirts that said Judeo-Banderite, right? In fact, Mr. Kolomoisky himself, troll par excellence, wore one, and partly universalized this hipster slogan, right? I am a Judeo-Banderite, right? I'm a supporter of Bandera against the Russian narrative, right? There's even a joke down in Odessa, you know, the one Odessan says to the other Odessa, "Did you hear about Azov and all those Nazis?" Yeah. The other guy says, "Yeah, oh, yeah, the entire synagogue's like that now." Right? So that's an Odessa joke, right? But as the Russians actually say, there's a portion of a joke in every joke. There's an element of truth telling to that, in that the Ukrainian Jews had to push back against this narrative in order to say it's not really important to us, and stop using these kind of noxious historical discourses to oppress our country and create a predicate for invading it and killing our friends, especially when the president's a Jew, his defense minister's a Jew, the head of presidential administration is a Jewish father, et cetera, et cetera. Arguably, everyone in the high chain of command of the Ukrainian army, at the very top, except Zaluzhny, has Jewish descent until the defense minister was changed for Crimean Tatar, right? So that's why I'm comfortable pushing back against all these Twitter trolls who call me a Nazi. When I'm a model liberal, by the way. I'm a completely universalist, old school 90s liberal in some ways. I'm very comfortable pushing back and saying, yeah, I'm a Judeo-Bandera. It's even my Wikipedia entry. Someone put my Wikipedia entry, very, very funny. And they continuously edit that out of my Wikipedia entry, and they put that under any comments that I have about Jews and Ukrainians, as if they're very clever. So Bandera, the quote unquote cult of Bandera, look, it makes a lot of people in the Jewish community uncomfortable. Obviously, it makes people in the Polish community even more uncomfortable. The Jews obviously have historical memory, and this is integral nationalism of the 1930s. Like anyone who in contemporary Ukraine wants to think about Bandera as a hero doesn't actually want to bring back the economic or political system of integralist nationalism. They're just looking for historical heroes, right? I see that Ukrainian Jews who don't even particularly like that see that is not something that is a mystery to us. They're not looking for Bandera as a historical lodestar. They're looking for heroes who fought against the Soviet Union, against Russian oppression, domination, right? That is understandable to me. I look at the integralist nationalists hero by hero, person by person. I personally think that Bandera is a great hero. Well, look, I don't represent anybody but myself. I'm not the leader of a Jewish organization. I am not Mr. David Harris or Mark Levin. I don't represent American Jews. I'm just a guy with a platform who wrote a book and knows a lot of stuff, but I'm just a fellow with my own opinion. I talk to a lot of older Ukrainian Jews, and they're like, okay, well, this is not pleasant that people in this country are valorizing a man of that generation, those viewpoints, but like whatever, I live here. I have other problems, including corruption, occasionally poverty, Russian invasion. Like the Bandera stuff is not that important. It also has to be seen within the context of a capture of national memory politics by one region, right? This is Poroshenko era national memory politics, which is not shared by the majority of the history is not shared by the majority of the 24 regions of Ukraine. Bandera has nothing to do with Crimean history, as far as I know. I don't even know if he even went to Crimea. I do know that he'd been to Odessa, as far as I remember. Mr. Bandera, you know, he had been in Odessa?
No idea.
Well, no, you've never. He was never at Galicia. Yeah, okay. I mean, there were other people in a circle who popped into other parts of Ukraine. This is very much a regional history. Like, it has nothing to do with Donetsk, and even very, very, very serious Ukrainian nationalists in Donetsk have other heroes. So the quote unquote cult of Bandera has to be seen through the lens of kind of American and Canadian diasporic like screw you to the KGB narrative, right? Like, it's almost a meme, a pre-Twitter meme. We're for Bandera because the KGB referred to anyone living in Toronto as a Banderite, right? Again, I wouldn't personally put up a statue to Bandera in my backyard, but like also there are statues to Khmelnytsky all over Ukraine, right? This is also a complex thing. Khmelnytsky doesn't bother me as much because it's 300 years ago. I mean, this is Bandera's vivid living memory, right? I mean, the point is these are incredibly complex arguments, and I do not see the Ukrainian people as complicit in what happened as I do, let's say, the French government or Vichy, right? The Ukrainians never had their own state, right? Under World War II. So I'm not a supporter of the cult of Bandera as my many trolls accuse me of being. I just don't think it's a serious issue when the Russians are trying to destroy our country, right? So when I was in Canada last week, just briefly before this, some Canadian Jews asked me, and Canadian Ukrainians asked me the Q&A of my question, what do you think about what happened with the Speaker of the Canadian Parliament? You all know what happened, right? And my answer was like, why the hell are we having this conversation when the Russians are bombing Odessa, which is a Jewish town and Russian-speaking town? Like, why are we having this conversation now? Why are we having this conversation in the middle of a genocidal war against us? These are completely ridiculous questions to be deciding now. We have a hand up in the back, but we'll get to you.
We'll open it up to questions in a few
You
minutes.
get to go first, but
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, not yet.
We
We're
okay.
gonna turn it to the public in about
Okay.
5 or so minutes.
yeah,
and
but you get to go first.
You'll go first.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to kind of wrap this up. I mean, I tend to agree with you that this is not a part of the usable past, but I think it's also important to contextualize it. The people who support the cult of Bandera don't support it for integral nationalist reasons.
No.
They defend him against charges that he was a collaborator. They say he sat in Sachsenhausen and all he was in, he made a tactical alliance with the Abwehr and the German intelligence.
Sure.
Just the same way as the United States had to go into an alliance with Stalin, which is equally morally objectionable. Each had different, pragmatic reasons for these kinds of decisions. But the most important thing is that there is no desire, there is no the cult of Bandera is not associated with anti-Semitism in Ukraine. It's one of the great paradoxes.
They don't understand, actually. They don't really understand. And I even explained this. I went to see a former prime minister of Ukraine 1 week before the war, and he asked me these questions as Ukrainian politicians do, thinking that I represent the World Jewish Congress, but they don't. They literally think I'm like. Often Ukrainian politicians think that I represent the Israeli Foreign Ministry or that I work for Ronald Lauder. Or that kind of thing. I don't like. I'm not a member in good standing of the foreign ministry or whatever. I do not I'm not the vice president of the World Jewish Congress. I'm just an intellectual who writes books and gives speeches and writes pieces and talks to people and tries to listen to people. But this former prime minister, I won't say who it was, and he asked me about the Bandera thing, and I said I gave him a shorter version of this explanation. He's like, yeah, but it's our history, and we don't hate Jews, and like it didn't kind of compute that Bandera is bad because it's bad for his relations with Poles and Jews. He's just like, well, this is a good thing because I come from that part of the country, and it's like we're looking for something nice, and there's nothing like there are other places in Eastern Europe, and let's say in our amongst some of our allies, let's say in a region north of Ukraine, where the revanchism is real and kind of like deeply unpleasant and very defensive. When a Ukrainian nationalist lies to me about Bandera, I see that as a kind of very, very, I see that as more like touching than it is dangerous, right? So that's my view.
Vlad, okay, so let me just conclude with one last thing, and that is in looking through these essays and reading them and remembering them, because I read many of them when you originally wrote them, I see that this insinuation of Ukrainian fascism in Russian rhetoric is not a very recent thing. It occurs certainly from the beginning of the Maidan forward. So really the entire book, when you refer to, Russian propaganda and discuss the Russian stance towards Ukraine, and Putin's own words, that is a component. But you also make a point of what you would call Putin's philo-Semitism and his attempt to, at the very least, accommodate the Jewish community. I would argue that Putin's philo-Semitism is based on an anti-Semitic beam. He believes Jews run the world.
Yeah,
I better be able to deal with them if I want to have influence in the world.
Sure.
But tell me about your understanding, because you wrote about the European Jewish Congress and about Putin's own historical memory work related to Jewish life. Say something about that, and then we'll open it up to you.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly interesting point. And I actually, not a mea culpa, but I talk about it in my essays in the book. And I write an introduction where I'm already saying that, it's actually gotten worse than what I say in this piece. I have a piece here called Putin and the Jews. It's complicated, and Putin to European Jews come to Mother Russia. He's a troll. I mean, he's a really kind of a nasty character with a nasty sense of humor and very thuggish. But he's kind of this vicious, kind of trollish, bullyish thing, who sees he actually is very thoughtful about history, but he's in the recent months actually gone further and further down the direction of gutter anti-Semitism. I think that what I wrote in this book when it was published, when the text went to the editors 4 months ago, has been superseded by events, and I talk about that in the introduction to the essays, where I say that by the autumn of 2023, visibly exasperated Putin was engaging in anti-Semitic commentary more often than he had ever before. That is not even enough to show how deeply in his frustration he's gone all in on like deeply gutter versions of anti-Semitism. So I think as he goes more like unhappy and like more frustrated the way the war is going, he's become more deeply in tune with his inner ugliness, and that is a heuristic for his view of the world and his worldview of the Jews. In fact, my own mother and my aunt 2 nights ago confronted me. They said, your book is not kind of nasty enough about Putin. My Russian aunt, my Russian aunt and my mother, who is a deeply pro-Ukraine, confronted me with saying that like you're actually not right. You're not saying how anti-Semitic he's gotten enough, right? And I will say that is the case. October 7th, let's just talk a little bit about politics. October 7th upended 30 years of Russian relationship to Israel. October 7th, everyone knows what happened October 7th. In fact, my own mother was in southern Israel. My own mother was in Ashkelon when it happened. And my mother was about a kilometer away, and then from what happened, and there were people being kidnapped in Ashkelon, but not killed in Ashkelon. The northern cadres of the Hamas guys got up to where my mom was, and then she got in a car and drove away. So thankfully my mom's okay. But my own mother was there, so tremendous trauma for my own family. Took her like 3 weeks to get over how deeply overexciting it was for my risk-averse mother. October 7th really realigned world politics. Will be an inflection point for American politics, for American history, regional history, the entire Middle East, the Levant, for decades, probably. For decades. We'll be living with the outcome of October 7th in the same way that we're still living in the world that September 11th built for us, or ruined for us, right? So one of the many things that happened after October 7th was that the Russians continued to degrade and downgrade their relationship to Israel. The philo-Semitic commentary from Putin gave way to meetings with Hamas, to more and more vicious jokes from Lavrov, to continuous accusations, renewed accusations of Zelensky being a Nazi, to trolling about the Americans' incapacity to deliver a two-state solution, to meetings with the Iranians, to all sorts of stuff, right? October 7th made the Russians have to choose between their Iranian partners. We do have an Iranian intellectual here. If he wants to say something afterwards, we'll call him. And the Arabs, who we also have relationships with, and the Israelis, right? The Russians are the only ones who, in their third world Soviet way, still have a web of relationships with everybody in the Middle East, right? The Russians are unique in this. And they upgraded relations with Iran. They upgraded relations with Iranian proxies. They, in a meeting with Prime Minister of Iraq in the Kremlin, made fun of the situation. Netanyahu got a call from Putin only 10 days after it happened, which did not include a condemnation, according to the readout of what happened. The Russians are pivoting more and more towards the Ayatollahs and against Ukraine and against the Western Liberal Alliance. So this has kind of destabilized the entire regional diplomatic structure of things, the security architecture, and his cooling relationship with Netanyahu over the last 2 years is part of it, and his increasing frustration at the way that his war has been flailing is part of it, and his reversion to ever more primitive forms of like Russian chauvinist gutter anti-Semitism are part of it, right? I think I've said enough.
Irina Yarosevich, I think you get the right of the first comment or question. But before we do, just kind of ground rules. It's okay to have comments, but it's not okay to go over 2 minutes. It's okay to ask questions or have comments,
Absolutely.
but 2 minutes is the reasonable.
Well, thank you. First, this is not part of the 2 minutes. Did you say you're unrequited 1990s liberal? As a unrequited 1960s, 70s liberal, welcome. I can't believe that. Suddenly I feel ancient. No, thank you. I mean, that's a really interesting phrase. I've never heard of that before. So thank you for saying that. Give me the 2 minutes.
Go ahead.
In the early 1990s, I did work for the Popular Movement of Ukraine, RUH, for their foreign media relations department.
RUH.
Yes.
For our non-Ukrainian friends, thank you.
Yes, Popular Movement of Ukraine. And one time a young man came from an American publication, the name of which I don't remember, as a freelance journalist to cover a story, which he did. And then afterwards he came to me and he said, listen, my grandmother gave me a piece of paper with an address of where we came from in Donetsk. Can you tell me how to get there? So I arranged for a trip for him, et cetera, et cetera. He comes back, he's pale. I said, oh my gosh, what happened? He said, my grandmother always told me that the story of our heritage in Ukraine is not that we were chased out because of pogroms, because of World War II. We were chased out by the Tsarist Empire because we were wealthy. He said you should see the building, the address of the building. Then we got into a very long, and this is what the point of the question is, getting back to your comment about Jewish Americans and how they see themselves now. The debate was definitely influenced by Russian disinformation and then Soviet disinformation of how Jews see themselves. So my question to you is, what do you see as, other than academics, as a way in order for Jews to reclaim their heritage in a more public way, in a more non-academic or general way, for them to understand that their history in Ukraine is much more complicated than just pogroms and Banderites?
That's a
Besides
good
your
question.
book.
Thank you. They should read my book, first of all, everyone. Yes, they should all read my book, absolutely. They should start
First
it.
they have to buy it.
First, they have to buy it. Yes, and get it signed. It's a wonderful question, very articulate, very eloquent, and very wise. First of all, Americans just aren't very good at memory politics. That's not what this country's made for, right? Like that, if they were good at that, they would have stayed in Europe, right? I mean, like American historical narratives and discourses are often very childish or like very primitive or very sentimental or very and I don't say this about my own community here. I just say that about Americans in general. That's my next book, right? Thank you. So that conversation often happens on very binary levels, or it's just not. It's not always a very sophisticated conversation, or sophisticated as it should be. I totally applaud the real communal interest in Ukraine now that is real. I know it's real because I give synagogue talks all the time, and I talk to Jews, all sorts of Jews, all the time, including my own post-Soviet people who usually their kids are historically illiterate, and even if their parents came and they came at 10, they often don't have great understanding of what went on. The third world is Soviet narratives, as you say, were very effective. The Soviet Union was actually good at some things. They weren't good at lots of things, but they were good at espionage. They were good at space stuff. They were good at propaganda. They were good at repressing people. They weren't so good at making consumer goods that people want. They weren't good at freedom. They were good at espionage, space satellites, rockets, repression, and propaganda. This is true, right? These are things that they excelled at when they were not good at other things, which are better. There a lot of these debates take place under the auspice of tremendous real trauma, and lack of historical understanding, and smudgy, smutne pamets, old memories, right? Kind of fuzzy memories. A lot of I don't like whenever I talk to Ukrainians and they're like, this is all KGB propaganda. I mean, yes and no. It's complicated, right? I mean, you can't say that either, right? There were bad things did happen, right? There were things that we have to deal with historically, which were very unpleasant for everybody, very unpleasant for probably Ukrainian patriots, right? And so I try to get people to see the good and to understand that this is a different country than it was under Nazi occupation or Soviet occupation, and that the traumas of Ukrainians are also intertwined with the traumas of Jews in these lands that we share together in Belarus and Ukraine and Eastern Russia. And I think often those conversations are very fruitful, and I have those conversations very often. I find those kinds of things very interesting, and they're always fascinated by my experiences, and they ask very good questions, and they're very interested. And I think Zelensky's becoming president of Ukraine did a lot to disarm those arguments. I think that the fact that the last generation of people who were alive during World War II and the Shoah Holocaust, the Holodomor, are passing off into history has both made it easier to have these arguments and also made them much more stupid and ahistorical in other ways. Can I say that? Right. I mean, we're at the point where we're not going to have living witnesses to the events of 80 years ago very soon. Right? People don't live that long. When I was a kid growing up in South Brooklyn, we had Holocaust survivors and Holodomor survivors on every floor of my apartment building. Literally, my mom would yell at me when I jumped up and down as a kid 30 years ago. She said, "Like, can you stop it? The lady below has numbers on her arm, right?" And at the time, I didn't know that that's not a normal experience growing up for most people in the world, right? And it certainly won't be an experience that anybody has in 5-10 years. And so as that generation passes off into the next world, these conversations will become a lot less touchy in some ways, more schematic in other ways, and more maybe hopefully more sophisticated.
Yeah, so if I could just add, since our organization tries to deal with some of these issues, the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, and I urge all of you who don't know it to go to the website Ukrainian Jewish Encounter.org. There's a wonderful timeline of Jewish-Ukrainian history. There's also a very rich set of essays, interviews, materials, and so on. But the point that I would first make is that part of the problem was that Ukraine, the country, was not part of this discourse, and you can't rely on a handful of diaspora Ukrainian scholars to carry the weight of a dialogue with a very expansive and extensive Jewish community. Now communities. Yeah. Ukraine is finding its voice. First of all, it's re-examining its own history, which is another obstacle that Ukrainians used to say, we have to first come to terms with what happened in the Holodomor. We have to document our own history, the history of repression in the Soviet period, before we can turn to other issues. And secondly, I think there is now a very wide range of literary projects, books, films, some of which you've reviewed, Lisa's film, even museum projects, some of them complicated, but nevertheless pushing in the right direction. And I think that the more the voice of Ukraine about these dark moments is part of the discourse, I think that'll also help improve, I wouldn't call them relations, but improve understanding. It's it'll be a more multidimensional understanding of that society. Tim Snyder, through the Bloodlands, I think, contributed by creating a broader understanding of what happened to these peoples on the territory of Ukraine between 1932 and 1945, just almost an endless wave of massive mayhem, which took tens of millions of people's lives. So I think that's another answer. We have time for 2 more comments or questions. Yes, over there, the gentleman.
I had the opportunity to speak to Mr. Ziesel, who's the head of the Jewish organization in Ukraine, and I asked him a very simple question. I said, is Yiddish literature very popular among Ukrainian Jews? And he looked at me like I was totally wacko. But I think at that time his English was not very good. Then a few years later, I asked the same question. I think I included the word Hebrew literature written in Ukraine. He says, well, there is some interest, but this is true of all, not just. I think he mentioned that some people might be interested, but it wasn't really widely popular. And I was just wondering, from your experience, your friends, colleagues in Ukraine, are they very interested or not at all interested in Yiddish or Hebrew literature that was written in Ukraine?
That's a great question. Let me think. Amongst Jews or Ukrainians?
Among Jews, their own literature.
Jews. Okay, their own literature. Ukrainian Jews the majority of them are not very lettered or erudite or learned because of communism. The communists did a very good job of repressing Jewish culture and learning in the lands that they occupied. And it was 3 generations of 75 years, 74 years, whatever it was, 3/4 of a century. It was enough time to wipe out Jewish learning amongst Jews in Belarus, in Russia, in Ukraine. My parents don't know anything about Judaism. They're completely their Jewish culture ends with their Zionism, right? They are deeply Soviet people, and it's up to me, my sister, and my cousins to and other people like that, the next generation, to recapture that. But the Jewish revival in all these places, and by these places I mean Eastern Europe as opposed to Central Europe, and I talk about this in the book, was carried out by ultra-Orthodox rabbis or Orthodox or Chabad rabbis, as opposed to Reform liberal rabbis or Reconstructionist rabbis. When in the 90s, Judaism returned to the communist lands as religion returned to every other community, because this is part of human life and community, and people need communal structures in order to face the chaos and horribleness of the world and the complete unknownness of what comes after the world. It was a Judaism which was brought by mostly American and Israeli rabbis from Hasidic movements, partly because their own ancestors came from there, and they took special pride in that. There is, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm thinking.
That's a
more-
preamble. It's a preamble to answer.
Okay, I'm
But go
thinking
ahead.
more secular there.
Right. Yeah, I know. I was getting to that answer, but I think that's important to understand, and I think it's also useful for our Ukrainian friends to understand that the majority of Ukrainian Jews are cultural Jews or secular Jews, and they don't have much Jewish education unless they really became very deeply into it and became black hats or very deeply religious. That does happen also. But they're a small minority of the population. The great plurality is not like that. There is a movement. Yiddish is a dead language in Ukraine. It's not a dead language in Antwerp or Brooklyn or Jerusalem or North London, but it is a dead language essentially in Ukraine, from Odessa to Chernowitz. There may be 100 old people in Chernowitz. I went and talked to them who speak it. When you hear a Jewish language in the streets of Kiev or Odessa, it's almost always Hebrew. It's almost always Israeli tourists or repatriated Ukrainians who lived for a long time in Israel, who came back for various reasons. So the Jewish writers who are translated from Yiddish, we'll end up in about 30 seconds, are usually translated from Hebrew as opposed to Yiddish. There are people who still read Sholem Aleichem, but that is a Soviet taste that stayed on into the modern Jewish literary cultures, Sforim and that kind of stuff, which would have been known to Jews of your generation in Israel and America and the Soviet Union. That's still what young Jews will be reading. They're not going to be reading the very sophisticated contemporary Israeli writers like Bloom or The Woman, not the literary critic, or I don't know. I mean, you will see like the main Oz or the other 2 main modern Israeli canonical writers translated into Hebrew, and there is Ukrainian Jewish Encounter actually has put a lot of effort into getting Ukrainian Jews and Ukrainians to read the work of Agnon, right? So Agnon, because he comes from Ukraine, has a certain amount of pull. But for the most part, I think it's easier to find a Philip Roth novel probably in Ukrainian than modern Israeli literature, right? This is also a different question because the Ukrainians and the Russians are separating their cultural bloodlands. The Ukrainians are building walls to Russian culture. That means also Russian publishing, which means Russian books being brought into Ukraine. 5-7 years ago, the Ukrainian bookstores were full of books which were published in Russia and literally brought from Russia by Ukrainian publishers. That's over now, and to even publish a book in Russian, you need a special permit from the Ukrainian state, and all the Jewish books being published in St. Peter's and Moscow is a huge revival of Jewish literature. That's not in the bookstores now. Thank you so much for your question.
Yeah, I think we've got just time for one brief comment. If there isn't any, I think it's better for us to end as we had planned, and I'm going to ask Vasil Machno to end the evening. No,
Your wife?
You came in late. You can't ask.
I'll talk to you later.
Okay.
That's all.
Alright, last short question about the reversal and actually reversal for the political nation.
Yes.
Will we discuss this next round table, as I understand, after both of wars finished with a victory? What about that? The most important is the topic of this meeting, actually.
I mean, I'm gonna like.
It wasn't your introduction.
There wasn't my introduction, which you would have heard if you'd been here on time. But like that aside, I mean, the Ukrainian Jews are a huge part of the revival of a modern Ukrainian state. I mean, they are integral to the revival of a liberal Ukrainian state, and they've done tremendous lot to build that state. They've done tremendous lot to defang this criticism and propaganda from the Russian side, right? Yeah, okay. And
So before we turn it over, I want to say there will be book signing. There are 2 price points. One is for by a credit card, which I think will end up being about $30.
Yeah.
But if you buy it in cash, it's $25.
That's right, yeah.
So Vlad can't change the lower price because he has some bookstore software through which to run credit cards, and it has a fixed price.
That's right.
Otherwise, it would have been all uniform pricing. But anyway, I will turn it
Okay.
over to.
And finally, I would like to thank to Vladislav and Adrian for the interesting book launch and discussion about a very important question, Ukrainian-Jewish relationship. Thank you for coming, and I invite all to the 3rd floor on the reception.
But only after you've bought a book.
Yeah, books.